exclusion, surplus humanity that it is, and it's creating those kinds of resistance, then you need the military more. You need the security. Then you see, it's not that that wasn't there. It was always there. It wasn't used so much maybe in the 50s against us, because our parents, or my parents at least, you know, after World War II, they wanted to be middle class, they wanted to make money, they wanted to have a nice house, so they bought into the system. But when in the 60s, when I was active, we started to be, more critical, and you had the Black Panther movement emerging, and all kinds of things emerging, all of a sudden the same nice, friendly, best friend of my uncle turns out to be, a police guy with access to weapons. In other words, that part of the system is always there. And I think you see that today. You see the emergence of a very strong securocratic system that bridges military and security and police, because the system feels that it's in crisis. And all over it's sort of losing control. And the question then is, for us, how do you resist that? And that's where we don't have very good strategies. And one of the things I'm trying to do, we won't know how to resist it unless we know what the technologies are. What are we up against? So I guess I should have said this before, I'm not presenting this to intimidate us. And my message isn't that this technology is so huge and overwhelming and they can control us and we might as well just go hide our head under the covers. What I'm trying to say is that technology is there and it's getting more repressive and more totalizing. But if we know what we're facing, we can begin to develop strategies of resistance. And we're going to have to do that more, because as the system gets more into a crisis, Paul Virillo, who's an interesting, so you might know him, a theorist, talks about the capitalism has entered into an endo-colonial phase. In other words, it's feeding off itself. Because capitalism always used to expand and there were new markets, and the violence was sort of spread out and was at the periphery of the system, because that's where you're conquering and that's where you're pacifying people. But now where it's feeding on itself and resources are scarce and the whole system is in crisis, now we're all exposed to those kinds of technologies that used to be in the colonial world, let's say, or in the global south. So we have to know what we're up against. And that's, I think, why this whole issue of securocratic war becomes so crucial. And finally, so okay, we're resisting, fine. I say the same thing to my Palestinian partners. I was here in a debate a couple of weeks ago on the one-state, two-state solution. And I'm saying we have to resist the occupation. And BDS is a part of it, our work and so on. But beyond resistance, what do we want? We don't have an end game to the Israel-Palestine conflict coming from our point of view. Do we want one state? What kind of one state? Do we want two states? Do we want 10? What do we want? And we're not. And it's the same here. We can resist the militarization, the pacification. We can understand what neoliberalism is doing. And we're good at that. The whole Occupy movement was very good at articulating that. But what do we want? Beyond the resistance. So I call it a human-centric hegemony. Meaning, of course, that the needs of human beings and the identities of human beings and the cultures of human beings and the well-being of human beings should be up front. But what does that mean? It's true. It's not well defined, and of course tonight I'm not going to get into it anyway. But I think there are some people thinking about it. They're talking about Walden Bellow was one of them, and Chomsky to some degree, and David Hart. There's people that write about counter-hegemony, Emanuel Wallerstein and others, but they're not very much part of our political discourse. They're academics out there somewhere. So I think part of our job as activists has to be to start to articulate what do we want? Where are we going? And the fact that it is vague, says that we have a lot of work to do.
Thank you. Any more questions? Not next to each other. Very convenient.
I would want to, I mean, I guess most people now, we understand that things are being blueprinted in Israel and in Palestine, and they're being exported, and it's something that Israeli politicians will always say, we have something to offer for you. If you wait, you know, this will come to Paris, this will come to Brussels, this will come to Ferguson. So you need to adopt the same systems and technology, etc. That's happening in most places. I was wondering where you've seen really good, not so much strategies, but good efforts at like systemic level in governments or in other systems where these efforts have been kept on a distance or been pushed out successfully. Like maybe not, didn't make headlines, but where you saw this being, that people were aware and effectively kept out these new influences.
Thank you very much. I think you had a very nice presentation. I want you to explain a little bit on the framing issue, because one way of dealing with framing is counter-framing. In journalism studies, that's probably one of the best ways of dealing with framing. And from what I see, the human
Wait, is what? I didn't hear.
Counter-framing. The best way of dealing with framing is counter-framing, and that's probably what you mean by maybe part of it is
or reframing.
Also, in addition to that, I would like you to a little bit explain on the missile complex system that you presented.
Okay, I'll take one more because it's here. I won't forget you then.
Thank you. A question on the big picture. If I understand you correctly, you want to defeat capitalism, starting with Israel, because Israel found a niche due to historic and geographic circumstances.
Yes.
Okay.
That was a yes or no question.
About the niche?
Well, it sounds a little bit like, try to defeat the capital, which in traditional view the Jews are in control of, due to in the Middle Ages they have been forced under certain circumstances to be the money people for the Christians in Europe. There's a certain parallel.
Okay, Jeff.
Okay.
I'm curious for the answer.
That's a no. That's a no question.
Let's hear it.
I don't know. This whole issue is interesting about resisting Israel. I mean, there's certain, places where it was seen. For example, in Ferguson, you mentioned Ferguson. And the whole movement of Black Lives Matter in the U.S. has a very strong Palestinian component. Because, of course, Israel is training the American police forces. So a lot of the tactics and a lot of the weaponry that are used in Ferguson, it came out during the Ferguson attacks on the black community there, that both the county and the city of St. Louis police forces were trained in Israel. Of course, it's a part of the militarization of the police in general. So I think that's kind of an interesting place where the people of Ferguson, the African American community of Ferguson, really saw that they were being Palestinianized. We have an expression in the peace movement in Israel that we're all Palestinians. And we mean that in the sense of solidarity, of course, with Palestinians. But you could take this analysis and you could actually make the case that we are all literally being Palestinianized. Are Palestinians from the point of view that we're all on the receiving end of police and security and military tactics and weaponry that's been developed on the Palestinians. So I think that the degree to which you can connect, the technologies that are used, the tactics that are used, rather than seeing them as disembodied, just the militarization of the police, where you can put them in a context, and you can say, well, these are weapons that have been developed on Palestinians, and therefore our struggle is like their struggle, and you begin to link those things. That's where I think the that's a political dimension. When you say the police are being militarized, that's a technical thing, and maybe it's a bad thing, and who wants, but it's abstract. And to ask the question, why are they being militarized? How are they being militarized? How is our struggle here like other struggles of others? That's where you begin to connect the dots, and so on. And I think the probably the BDS movement is the best example, or one of the best examples, of how, just getting into the framing too, how the Israeli oppression is being reframed as oppression, not as, the governments are presenting it as self-defense. Israel has a right to defend itself, and critical people, including critical Israelis and Palestinians and others, are saying, no, this is actually a oppression and repression. Our governments are a part of it in this and this, and we should be resisting through BDS, through boycotts, divestments, and sanctions. So, I think, and again, from my point of view, Israel, I don't accept the idea that Jews run the world or run the capitalist system. With all due respect to the Jews, they're not the Rockefellers and the Gateses and the people that really run the system. But nevertheless, I think looking at Israel is a kind of a good window into the way pacification is done, so the BDS movement, in a sense, has the ability to globalize. You can start with Israel. It's happening now. You started with avocados from the Jordan Valley and don't buy Ahava cosmetics. One of the first BDS campaigns was against Caterpillar bulldozers that are demolishing Palestinian homes. These are clear either settlement products or weapons or whatever. Now we're getting into protests against Elbit systems. There was a takeover of the Elbit plant in the UK that's building the wings of not only Israeli drones, but of the Watchkeeper drone of Europe. Now we're going from BDS to looking at, Horizon 2020, which is the EU. Israel is the largest non-European recipient of EU money for research and development. It's in this Horizon 2020 program that goes a lot into the military. So here you have an absurd situation where yesterday Netanyahu says, we're cutting the Europeans out of the peace process. They're anti-Semites, we hate them, they don't like us, you're out, but we want the billions of euros that you're giving us in Horizon 2020 for our military. So I think the BDS movement has that potential of expanding and beginning to link up, and it's almost becoming a mirror into European society. What are we in Europe supporting? What weapons are we developing? What are we using? So that's where it's growing. You take something like BDS and Israel, and you begin to globalize it. So that's a kind of a reframing, I think. And this whole issue of framing and reframing is very important. And again, as part of the reframing, I think this whole idea of pacification is really important, because that's what leads to those critical questions of who's pacifying us and how and why are they doing that. And then finally, just to get into the missile system, I'm trying to show that pacification is a part of securitization, and in fact, we talk about anti-war movements, and the weapons of war are very sexy and very big and wars, of course, are very dramatic, and people die and they're very intense. But in fact, I'm trying to draw with this missile idea, the idea of control and pacification and securitization at the very unsexy, invisible level of policing. Because wars happen once in a while, but policing is always. You're living in a security state here, in all kinds of ways that you see and don't see. And we don't always pay attention to the police and disciplining. Prisons, for example, the whole issue of prisons, and forms of discipline, and securitization and so on, because they're somehow abstract, they're very technical, they're not very sexy, they're sort of a part of everyday life. And that's the idea of the missile complex, is to try to pull together these kind of invisible elements of securitization and make them as visible as the military part is.
Okay, I'm gonna take this question, and there's one more. If you had already had a question, so if there's someone else, if not, yes, you? Okay, sorry, Alice.
I have two small questions. Maybe you can explain to me how the Israeli military industrial complex continuing get financial support. First question. Second question, how we can organize against the pacification of financial institutions, not to they don't have to invest in Israel military industrial complex. I think that is my question.
So my question is, you said that we don't know as a left movement or whatever what we want. I don't really agree with that. I think we do know, but it's more in terms of values. So, you know, if you look at the capitalist system that's always growing, okay, we can continue to do that, so we need to put the planet and, you know, environment in the center of our economic system. So we have maybe all these values, but how can we really implement them? Because as you said, most people thinking about this is from humanities and social sciences. So if we're up against this like super technological stuff that does really seem like science fiction, I mean, how are we going to implement it? And you spoke a little bit about globalizing BDS, but that's still not the answer then if you say we need to develop alternatives, because that's again protesting and stopping things. But you know, how can we make this human-centric hegemony?
You know, in Israel, I mean, it is a military industrial security complex. So the financial is a mixture of, you know, in capitalism, there's a hand in glove. That was the word I was looking for. A hand in glove relationship between governments and the capitalist system. The capitalist system wants to work by a free market and its own profits and its own investments and everything else, but when that doesn't work very well, it needs governments to come in and give it research, for example, research and development. I mean, these weapons, I mean, that's part of it, you know. A lot of the technologies that we live with, from our computers to, you know, and I have a joke a little bit, you know, about BDS, you know, you're boycotting Israeli products, fine. But you know, the USB stick is an Israeli product. So how far are we going to go in terms of boycotting Israeli technologies? We're going to give up the USB stick. So, you know, but that's the point. Is that that these things are all intermeshed. You know, and one of the difficulties of separating military spending and finances and so on is this whole idea of dual use. That the same, you know, the same computer that pilots a nuclear missile, you know, pilots your personal computer. The GPS system that you use to find this place is exactly the same system that's used to target missiles. So what's military and what isn't military is very difficult, and that's where governments and the military security industry come together, because a lot of these technologies are too expensive in the early stages, or not, for corporations to develop, or they don't want to invest so much money in research and development, and the government takes that as part of their military stuff, and then the byproducts that we enjoy are the civilian parts of it. So we're a part of that system. So I think the answer is that it's a mixed thing. It's certainly in Israel, where the government has its own agendas of selling arms, developing arms. Private industry is very good. Israel's high industry is one of the top in the world because it's a byproduct of the military industries. And they're going to the military and saying, we have these technologies that you can sell, and the military has the markets. And then that, of course, develops products that then can be sold in civilian capacities as well as military. So it's very complicated, and I just met with the SIPRI people in Stockholm. You know, SIPRI is a Swedish organization that monitors the global arms trade and deals with defense economics, which is very complicated. And you know, it's really good what they do, because they help us to unravel and see how our governments and who's buying weapons and who's selling weapons and who the largest corporations are. And you know, they break it down for us. But it's material that people don't know. I mean, it's put in a form that unless you're really researching, it's not available to activists in a sense. So a lot of that is kind of invisible. And that gets me into this whole, just what you were saying about, we know where we're going kind of, and that is that I think we have to be much more specific in terms of not just our vision, but where are we going if we want an alternative kind of a system. For example, the environmental movement. Great. You know, the largest polluter in the world is the military. Now, I've met with Greens, the Green Party of every country almost. I've met with Greens, I don't think the military has ever been high on their agenda. I don't remember Greens talking very much about military spending or the pollution caused by just the ammunition. Can you imagine in Afghanistan or Syria or Iraq or places, the amount of lead and gunpowder and metal, and of course depleted uranium if you have certain kinds of bombs and this in the environment? But we haven't connected those dots. The environmental movement hasn't. So how do you get to a better environment unless you end war? In the end, it's all connected up. And so what I want to end on, I think, is this idea that we really need to dialogue with each other, kind of. And starting with the hard scientists and most of us. Because, for example, I think it's very important to know what's gelling, what's cooking in the world of technologies. You know, so we know what we're up against, but also that we know I mean, I can't evaluate what's a myth and what isn't. When I talk about nano-weapons, what do I know about nano-weapons? I mean, you know, I'm not, you know, it's a field, nanotechnologies. So I can read and I'm informed, but I don't know if what I'm reading about cloaks that can make tanks invisible, that I read about in military journals and so on, is true or not. So we need, I think, if the technology part and the military part is a part of our political discourse and the way we have to develop our thinking as the left, I think one of the first things is we have to get into a dialogue between the hard scientists and the soft people like us, like most of us, to try to really begin to understand this world, this technological world that's developing, that I don't think we take. I mean, we talk about values, and that's great, but I don't know how far that gets you. And we really have to kind of know the nitty-gritty, and that's one of the things, I seriously, I apologize at one part of my book, and I say this is going to sound like a catalog, but I think I just laid it out, different kinds of systems. Not that I was the expert, but you know, within a certain amount of text, as much as I could, I just tried to get it out so that people could take those threads and go on with them. So I think it just reveals a whole world of militarism and technologies and pacification and security, all kinds of words that maybe aren't so clear, but that are really crucial for the capitalist system that we're living in, that's in a state of decline. And as it's declining, it's getting more violent and more unequal. And so really, it's getting urgent that we begin to get on top of what's happening.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I thank you all for being here, and of course, now you're really curious. Come, buy a book, or any other book, or this book, or donate. But thank you very much for being here with us, and we hope to see you on another occasion very soon. Have a good night.
Thank you much for